Open it up and begin with a welcome. My name is John Grimm, and I'm going to moderate this panel. And our plan is that John Haught will speak for 25 minutes, and we're here, of course, to celebrate and explore the new cosmic story inside our awakening cosmos, our awakening universe. So this opportunity to really explore one of the issues that's been at the center of the discussions here at the Big History Conference. And we have a wonderful group of panelists who I will introduce as they speak. But I have the occasion to bring forward Jack Haught and to turn the floor over to him. Jack, of course, is emeritus from Georgetown and the author of an extraordinary number of articles, books, talks, and I want to draw out especially Jack's presence in the dialogue with the new atheists, especially Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, an individual who's been willing to put himself out there to dialogue in a civilized and frank manner with the issues that we're all here to try and grapple with. I myself grapple with them. I just came from the Crow Reservation, where I participated in a ceremonial called Ashkise Liswa. The Crow people are Apsalake. They use that word Ashkise to talk about a lodge that they built. So the ceremonial is built in a big lodge. Ashkise is a lodge, and the structure of the lodge is the structure of the cosmos. And it's very clear what they're doing. They build a clan system into the lodge. Every rafter pole the same, so it's a living entity. That Ashkise, that big lodge, is where they go to Liswa, to dance. So the sense of a people who are putting themselves in a cosmological frame, and they're entering into it in an effort to feel their feet on the ground, to greet the sun in the morning. It has a definite performance ritual, but I think more important, Crow themselves speak of it as relational. The dance and their presence is relational. They're establishing a relationship to their presence on this earth with the sun, with cosmological realities, establishing a relationship that flourishes the land, the biodiversity, and the people. So part of what I think we're exploring today are these large issues of relationship, and where Jack is taking us in this beautiful book is an entry into the sense that I see in your eyes right now. I see the quality of anticipation. You know, when will this guy stop talking? So let's do that.
Thank you very much, John. Very honored to be on this panel with friends and fellow scholars. And John implied that my background is in theology and science. Some of you might not know what a theologian is. Theologians are people who don't make much money, but at least they know why. I'm here because I'm interested in reception of big history by the world of religion in general, and by religious colleges and universities and schools in particular. And there seem so many people, and perhaps there is, a problem doing so. Is there a consonance between big history and religion in any sense of the term? I'm speaking especially out of the Abrahamic traditions, but I think what I have to say will apply to religions in other settings as well. The problem seems to be, primarily, how do you reconcile the static, vertical, hierarchical view of traditional religion, religious philosophies, with this new 13.8 billion year cosmic story? How can you map one onto the other? It seems to be impossible for many people. Traditionally, the universe was not going anywhere itself. At best, it was a stage for the human drama. Perhaps also, in a more positive way, at times the beauties of nature were meaningful in that they could point to the eternal present beyond. But in general, Western religions, especially influenced by Plato and Aristotle and others, have thought of ultimate human fulfillment as lying beyond this world. The question of whether the cosmos has some fulfillment is not one that traditional religion and theology has spent much time talking about. And so faith in this vertical, hierarchical universe, this ladder of levels, starting with lowly matter at the bottom, then plant life, then animal life, and human consciousness, all supervised, superintended, taken into the care of ultimate reality and meaning. Faith seems to be a journey of detaching oneself from the universe so as to eventually achieve climactic communion with God. And I think we have to recognize here that this way of looking at religion and God and human destiny and the meaning of life is still one that gives meaning to millions and millions of people. And in my own experience, it's very difficult for those who are really tied into this way of thinking to appropriate the history. Before or after our religions became literate in the pre-scientific period of human history, they often looked upon the universe on the analogy of a book. And just as a book can be read at many different levels of meaning, so also they thought can the universe. So that to a monkey, the book is just black marks on a page. And is the monkey wrong? No, but the book can mean more. To a child who's just learned the letters of the alphabet, the book is a treasure trove of letters of a code. Again, the child is not wrong, but the book can mean more. To an adolescent, the narrative structure might allow the adolescent to see a kind of meaning or narrative meaning in it, but to an adult, the same book can be an expression of wisdom. So the book can be read at many different levels, and so traditional religion thought of nature often as a kind of book as well that could be read at many different levels. The key point is that in order to see the deeper meanings of the universe, one has to go through a process of personal transformation. And religions, even some philosophies until modern science, had exercises to prepare one to make one's mind adequate. The medievals referred to adequatio, the adequatio intellectus et re, the adequacy of the mind to reality. You can't take it for granted, you have to go through a personal process. And I think that if the representatives of the great traditions were here today, they would probably say that modern science and big history too, to the extent that it's based solely on scientific ways of looking at things, it isn't wired to detect what's really going on. This would be the religious way of looking at things. But things are more difficult today, perhaps, or perhaps much more interesting, because one book is hardly enough to represent what's going on in this cosmos. I taught students at Georgetown a course in science and religion for about 35 years, and every semester I would ask them, just to get a sense of the scale of the universe, to imagine the 13.8 billion year cosmic story in 30 volumes. Before I stopped teaching, it was 13.7, so the universe has gained a lot, so I have to completely revise my syllabus, I suppose. Anyway, in this 13.8 billion year story, the Big Bang, each book represents 450 pages. Each page stands for 1 billion years. The Big Bang would take place on page 1 of volume 1, and you notice the first two shelves and part of the third consist of essentially lifeless and mindless material stuff and processes. Life was not in a hurry to come into this universe. The Earth spins out around the sun 4.5 or so billion years ago, and then a billion or so years later, the first sparks of life begin to glow, but not terribly brightly. They remain pretty much unicellular until you get almost to the end of volume 29, where the famous Cambrian explosion takes place 500 to 600 million years ago. Then life begins to become much more complex at an accelerated pace. Dinosaurs don't come in until after the middle of volume 30. They go extinct around page 386, and that leaves only the last 64 pages for the development, the flourishing of mammalian life, and eventually our primate ancestors and then ourselves. When do we come in, humans capable of intellection, of ethical aspiration, and of religion, religious aspiration? Only in the last fifth, perhaps, of the very last page of the very last volume. So I would ask my students, if you're a thoughtful person, what do you make of this? What's going on in this set of volumes? And is there anything going on there that you can connect to a religious interpretation of the universe? Certainly not literally, but is there some way at a deeper level you might connect it to religious consciousness? And the way I approach it is to ask whether there's an inside story where meaning is somehow registered. Stories are the carrier of meaning, so the question is whether in some sense this great big story is able to carry any sort of meaning. If it does, how should we go about reading it? And there's a problem because you'll notice that this horizontalizing of cosmic history has flattened, pancaked the traditional hierarchy so that matter, which was the lowest level in the traditional vertical hierarchy, is now the dominant feature in this new cosmic story, or so it seems. Light comes in as a kind of fluke in this last row of books, and mind seems to show up almost as a cosmic afterthought. At least this is the way scientific history seems to present the picture of this universe to students and others today. And meaning, which was the highest level of all in a traditional hierarchical scheme, is now in modern and postmodern thought often thought of simply as a projection, a fiction, a concoction, a construct that humans invent and project back onto the universe to make it seem a little bit warmer, perhaps, than it is. So how do you go about reading this? Can we find any sort of spiritual meaning that has the same intensity and fervor as the classical hierarchy nourished in this 30-volume set? And of course, 30 volumes so far. Who knows how many more volumes remain to be written? The point is the universe is still coming into being. Now this problem that I'm talking about, how to reconcile cosmic history with religion, is something that the Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was thinking of almost 100 years ago as he was working in China as a paleontologist, one of the main geologists of the Asian continent. This Jesuit scientist was feeling within himself a tension that a lot of people sense and even today feel, especially people who are educated scientifically. And he called it the problem of the two faiths. How do you reconcile faith in God, in ultimate reality and meaning? How do you reconcile that with the world, the attraction we have to living within the natural world? He called it the problem of the two faiths, to believe in God or to believe in the world. Traditional spirituality gave us this impulse to leave the world behind, I talked about with respect to the hierarchical understanding, and God was thought of as up above. But then Teilhard was aware, as not too many religious people were back in the early 20th century, of how science, geology, biology, Big Bang cosmology, cumulatively, has given us a sense that this world that we live in is still coming into being. And he says that should change everything, especially if you're both religious and scientist. You can't have the same thoughts about God, the same thoughts about religion or virtue or anything we associate with religion in the hierarchical scheme now anymore. So he pointed out that what science has given us is the sense that this world has a future in a way that previous religions throughout the ages did not have. So what do we do with religion now that we have a sense that this world is still coming into being? And he thought just as there's a temptation on the part of traditional religion to leave this world behind, so also now there's a naturalistic temptation to think of this world as all there is. And many people, as you know today, are quite happy with that. The universe has become so big that they can just slip themselves, including their spiritual instincts, inside this large universe and would say that this is enough. Why do we need anything else? Well, for Teilhard, and this is true of myself too, ultimately naturalism is a dead end because it ultimately implies that this whole achievement of life and consciousness is eventually going to go down the pit of nothingness. And if you think about that really long and hard, what kind of understanding of life will you end up with? I'm not going to go into that now, but I think it's a good question to ask. So this was a lifelong question for Teilhard, and I'm just translating it into the question I'm dealing with today. Is big history in any way reconcilable with a religious worldview? And what I do in the book, just to make a long story short, I don't want to take up too much time, is to point out that I think there are three main ways of reading this new cosmic story, two of which are open to religion, one of which is not. The first I'll call the analytical view, the second the analogical worldview, and the third the anticipatory worldview. These are ways of reading this new cosmic story. There are probably others too, but I found these to be the three main ways people look at it. The analytical approach to reading the story is to seek understanding and seek intelligibility in this story, primarily by digging back into the past and trying to rediscover the earliest possible phases of the cosmos, and then tracing a series of causes from the past to the present in order to explain what's going on here and now in the universe. We could also call it the archaeological view or the archaeonomic view, I call it in the book. It's a view which says we have to get a handle on this cosmos. You have to get back to origins as far as possible. And I think that's a deep instinct that underlies big history. Big history wants to get back as far as possible into everything that's happened in the past, with the implication being that's how we will make the universe intelligible. So a lot of people follow this approach. It's also atomistic because since we can't literally go back to the past, we can do the next best thing, and that's to take present complex things and break them down into their subordinate particulars, so that as we do so, the particulars become finer and finer, more granulated, more dispersed, and that sort of recapitulates the earliest phase, subatomic phase of our cosmos. That's one way of reading it. The analogical way is the one that corresponds to the hierarchical view, which I started with today. And this view maintains that the meaning of things can come through to us if we look upon them as analogies or symbols that somehow reveal to us something about ultimate reality and meaning, about the eternal present. And many people are very satisfied with that approach to looking at the cosmos. Notionally, theoretically, they might accept the 13.8 billion year old universe, but it religiously does not mean anything, because to them, religion is a matter of reading nature as sacramental, as somehow mediating the sacred eternal present. And so they're not terribly interested in the future of this cosmos. They're interested in it as a place where symbols and sacraments of deity are there to point us toward that which is infinite and perfect. Then there's what I call the anticipatory approach. And this is an approach which I'm suggesting, and this is the main point of my book in a way, is to advocate an anticipatory way of reading the cosmic story. Taking seriously the fact that it is narrative, that it is a story, and perhaps even a dramatic story, the anticipatory approach realizes that we can't make complete sense of anything right now. Because in looking at the intelligibility that a story gives, you have to wait for its narrative coherence to show up on the horizon of the future. And we can't be too greedy about concluding that we know what the universe is all about here and now, but that we have to adopt an epistemological posture which is not very popular in current intellectual life, but I think it's one that corresponds nicely with knowledge of this narrative that we're involved in. Like any narrative, you have to put on a disposition of bridled expectation, of patience, so as to let it unfold. When you start out reading a novel, say a Dostoevsky novel or something like that, the first chapters are scattered fragments that you can't put together. They only come together to follow the narrative into the future. And I'm wondering if something like that might not be the proper epistemological analogical disposition will take with respect to this cosmos now that we very recently have arrived at awareness that it's a story that's still unfolding. So the first approach, the analytical approach, sees the story, but no meaning in it. The analogical approach sees meaning, but basically ignores the narratives, the storied character of the cosmos. Whereas the anticipatory approach sees the story, recognizes that we're still immersed in it, but waits for the meaning to emerge. And that means to put on the disposition of hope. So we can call the first approach cosmic pessimism because it sees no meaningful outlet or the goal or purpose to the cosmos. The second approach is one of otherworldly optimism, which basically ignores the universe too, except to the extent that it points symbolically or analogically to the infinite. And the third approach, call it cosmic patience. And we can associate each of these ways of looking at the world with, respectively, three figures from antiquity. The figure of Democritus would still be relevant to a lot of contemporary scientific thinkers. Democritus, who thought that all you need to understand the world are two concepts, atoms and the void, and the whole of history is simply a reshuffling and reconfiguration of these uncuttable, irreducible particles. But that's very appealing. Alex Rosenberg at Duke University thinks this way. Daniel Dennett, this is how he understands evolution, basically. So that's a name that's still very much alive. Plato would be the chief source, I think, of this otherworldly optimism. In many ways, Christianity has been more Platonic at times than it has biblical. And the third approach I would associate with the character of Abraham, who represents all those who are willing to launch forth adventurously into the future without knowing exactly where they're going, but anticipating some possibilities that might lie up ahead. And to make a long story short, what I'm suggesting is that, to me at least, the Abrahamic way of looking at the cosmos is one way in which to integrate the new cosmic story with at least some of the features of traditional religion. And it looks for narrative coherence, but it emphasizes that we need to wait. So the question then for me is, which of these three readings makes the most sense? The analogical reading is still very attractive. It operates according to a hierarchical principle, which maintains that a higher level can encompass a lower, but a lower cannot encompass a higher. It maintains that to understand the lower level, it's not enough that you become an expert in the lower levels. You have to undergo a process of personal transformation in order to understand what the universe is really all about. And ultimate reality, if it exists, is incomprehensible. According to the hierarchical principle, ultimate reality can grasp us, but we cannot grasp it. However, we can have an awareness of it, which that's the meaning of faith. Faith is not belief without evidence, as perhaps the new atheists understand it, but faith is an awareness of being grasped by something of ultimate significance and ultimate importance, and allowing yourself to be carried away by it. And this scheme allows for a lot of people, it's very appealing because, incidentally, I think the religious and ethical and political and legal sensibilities of almost everybody in the world still adheres roughly to something like this static vertical hierarchy, because it allows you to think of matter as less than everything else. Life has something that matter doesn't, let's call it vitality. Animal life has something else, not just vitality, but sentience, so it's M plus X plus Y. And humans are not only conscious, but they're conscious that they're conscious. So we can say that they have something more than what's going on here. And this functions as a basis for valuation, for ethics, and still does. Still very much prevalent in our political and legal thinking, at least tacitly so. The problem with this very attractive vision, at least attractive to many people, is that it has no allowance for what science has told us about deep cosmic time. that's kind of irrelevant to this way of looking at things. And that's one reason why many religious people, probably most, will not catch on quickly to big history. And there's little interest, furthermore, in this world's future. The interest is in my future, my destiny, my self-purification, to be worthy of eternal life. It ignores also the gradualism, that there are no sharp breaks between and among the different levels of the hierarchy. And ultimately, it's ecologically problematic today because it allows us to feel that somehow we are separate from the cosmos. And so the question is, can you really feel at home in nature if you accept this traditional hierarchical way of looking at things? Nonetheless, it is attractive to many people. Well, what about the analytical reading of the universe? Is this any better? It seems intellectually attractive because it allows us to reduce the X, Y, and Z factors to M and make things measurable, quantifiable. But it leaves us with an essentially mindless, lifeless, and aboriginally pointless universe, which is measurable perhaps, but not necessarily a context within which human beings can find satisfaction of their religious impulses and tendencies. Life and mind, according to Peter Atkins, Oxford physical chemist, is just simplicity masquerading as complexity. So is this a coherent way of reading the universe? I'm going very fast here, and obviously I'm not nuancing this enough, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to say that here's where my own reading of Teilhard has been very helpful to me, at least. This is how I see it. This is how I would answer the question, whether the analytical view is coherent or not. And I'll stop with this. To analysis, that is, to the scientific analysis, the world becomes, Teilhard says, more and more incoherent, dispersed, fragmented, granulated, the farther you go back in time. So you take any present example of living complexity and subject it to scientific analysis, that's pretty much the same as going back to the cosmic past. But the cosmic past was scattered and dispersed. It was decoherent in a way. So if you take an organism and break it down into cells, and cells into molecules, large molecules, and large molecules into smaller clusters of atoms, and then you get to atoms, and then break those down into the subatomic entities. The further back you go, the more diffuse and dispersed and fragmented, incoherent, or decoherent, Descartes calls it, the universe becomes. So instead of finding intelligibility, the further back you go, you find unintelligibility. So how do you find intelligibility? You find intelligibility by, after you've gone all the way back with the analytical approach, turn around 180 degrees and look forward toward the future. And what you see happening is that the entities start coming together into more coherent and more complex entities. So you can't really understand what an atom is until you wait until you see what it does when it joins with others to make molecules. Or you can't understand molecules until you wait and see what they can do in the context of cells, and cells in the context of organisms, and so forth. So we arrive now back in the present. So how do we make sense of the universe at present? The Teilhardian way, the anticipatory way, is to adopt epistemologically the posture of waiting expectantly and hopefully to see what will take place on the horizon of the future. And this is how he reinterprets the whole meaning of faith and hope within the context of our contemporary understanding of the universe. Coherence lies in the future. So it's only by looking toward the future that we can find out what's really going on inside the cosmic story. And we need a shift of worldview to make sense of that. And he calls it the anticipatory vision. And I'll just stop with this. The anticipatory vision looks upon the universe not as a Democritean reshuffling of particles, but as an awakening. And we are part of that awakening. What's going on in this room right now is you're anticipating understanding, perhaps not finding it, is the universe through you, through your mind, is awakening to meaning and hopefully to truth as well. So, and then understand the hierarchy. You don't have to dispense with it completely. You don't have to flatten it out completely, as the analytical view does. But think of the hierarchy as an emergent one. So matter comes forth early in many subtle ways. Then life emerges from that, and then mind, and then culture. So it's a pretty good universe that's an awakening through a lot of different ways, including science, as well as religion. So you can easily integrate science, I think, with religion. You don't have to edit anything out of science to embrace the anticipatory worldview. And the ultimate reality and meaning, or a God, would function in this cosmos, as Sirak puts it, as a power of attraction. Yes, God is both alpha and omega, but God is more omega than alpha in this way of thinking. The world, instead of resting on the past, as the analytical view, the archaeological view has it, the world rests on the future. Because it's only in the future that intelligibility emerges in its most intense form. The world rests on the future, Sirak says, as its sole support. So how do we face reality? Not by breaking it down into subordinate particulars, but by waiting, hoping, and creative action to build the future. So, well, I don't want to take up any more time. There's lots more to be said, but this is, I hope, gives you a sense of what I'm trying to do.
Jack, for a lucid and rather exciting synopsis of part of the new cosmic story. It's a much richer text that he was able to lay out in the time that he had. And even that this last line that's up there, connecting what he has said to the question of subjectivity is something he takes up at length in the book. And I think it will come up in the questions. And our respondents have the opportunity to raise their questions, their observations. And let's begin with Professor Ursula Goodenough. Is that good? Okay? Yeah. Sitting here next door. Ursula is an emeritus professor of biology at Washington University and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the author of The Sacred Depths of Nature. So as a cell biologist and former president of the Cell Biologist Society, she has addressed this question in her own understanding. She has also participated in the Journey of the Universe project in the Conversation interview series and in assisting us in the development of the Journey of the Universe book. So Ursula, we're very keen to hear your insights.
So I'm going to do what I usually don't do. I'm going to read what I have to say. I usually have PowerPoint and arrows, but my thinking was sufficiently dense that I just couldn't do it any other way. So this is my usual mode, but here we go. When I obtained the Kindle version of Jack's book and got the gist of where the book was going, I used its search engine to look for mention of Terry Deacon, a neuroscientist at UC Berkeley, who considers topics along the same lines. I got a single hit, found in the endnotes, which reads as follows. Terence Deacon, in his recent book, Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerged from Matter, 2012, seems to be aware of the anticipatory character of nature, and he rightly struggles to find a worldview that can accommodate the fact of emergence. In the end, however, he fails to break out of the archaeonomic, so that would be the analytical, frame of mind that he shares with most other scientific thinkers today. Unquote. This was pretty stunning, since I understand the whole point of Terry's 600-page book to be to break out of the archaeonomic frame of mind. Moreover, from my perspective, and from the perspective of many scientists who have absorbed Terry's work, his articulation of the emergence paradigm, far from being a struggle, is singularly profound, rigorous, and germinative. In Jack's book, the Kindle search recovered 146 hits for the term emergence. However, I found only one instance where he offers a definition of emergence. Quote, the arrival of unpredictable new organizational principles and patterns in nature. My computer has decided to switch off for a while. I'm sure there's a way to fix that, but I will just keep clicking. Where was I? The arrival of unpredictable new organizational principles and patterns in nature. That's Jack's definition of emergence. And I did not find clarifications as to how these principles and patterns might arise. Therefore, I've elected to use my time to present a summary of Terry Deacon's perspective on emergence as it pertains to the origin of life, this being the initiation of what Jack calls the inside story, although sometimes he extends it back, in hopes that Jack will comment on its relevance to his views. For the materialist, as Jack repeatedly reminds us, nothing exists except matter, its movements, and its modifications. Terry and I would say that this is the case for the non-living universe, and that such cause and effect interactions also undergird the existence of life forms. However, life forms possess additional features that are absent from non-life. These are not added to matter. Rather, they are generated by the life forms themselves, bottom up. Terry starts with the second law of thermodynamics, which may get you all thrown, which states that materials are regularized or that are regularized and ordered will, over time, become unregularized or disordered until they're in a maximally mixed up state. Irregularity is characterized by the term entropy. At maximal entropy, interacting materials are maximally irregular. The generation of order requires work, whereas it takes no work to generate disorder. It happens spontaneously. Present-day life forms all display regularized activities that require work. Eating, photosynthesizing, metabolizing, negotiating the environment, reproducing. These activities cease when a life form dies, and the life form quickly becomes maximally disordered, even though all the constituent materials are still present. Since all modern life forms share common ancestry, the core question becomes, how did the original life forms set things up to regularize and hence remain alive, defeating the second law by not falling apart? Terry calls this original life form an autogen, without specifying what material it was made of or what it looked like. Once such an autogen showed up, then its particularities would be expected to evolve, eventually assuming the familiar features of present-day life forms, with proteins, DNA, lipid membranes, and so on. The hard part is to initiate a life form in the first place. In Terry's model, the autogen sustains cycles of autocatalysis and assembly-disassembly that reinforce one another to generate and to reproduce the autogen. A key feature of his model that distinguishes it from other emergence versions is that these dynamics operate by subtraction. So you may have heard of emergence as being something being more than the sum of its parts. Terry would say perhaps that it's less than the sum. Regularized cycles serve to constrain other possibilities, less regular possibilities, from occurring. Hence, autogens and other life forms are not just any chemistry. They are highly constrained chemistry, chemistry limited to the regenerative interactions that keep the life form alive. The second law describes what happens in the absence of constraint, the general tendency towards irregularity or mixed upness. In life form, constraints emerge from interactions that progressively reduce possible alternatives. Reductions of most possible paths make some paths more probable than others. Constraints and their resultant absences are fully natural. They are emergent from material interactions, and they act on material interactions. But they are not the materials themselves. Hence, the materialist mantra, nothing exists except matter, its movements, and its modification, has been amended by life forms. By constraining material interactions, life forms generate both order and novelty. We can at this juncture introduce an important change in terminology. Each life form, all the way back to the first autogen, is in fact a self, an entity capable of doing self-directed work, self-regenerative work, by itself and for itself. A foundational feature of all selves is that they have aims. Non-selves have no aims. A rock does not aim, does not endeavor, does not try to roll down a hill or undergo erosion. It just does. By contrast, a self generates constraints that channel energy into work that regenerate these very self-same constraints. The self has a goal, to stay alive. The advent of selves marks the advent of purpose, the advent of telos, not only on Earth, but anywhere in the universe where selves come into being. Importantly, Jack lifts up this feature of life as well, originally in his 2003 book, Deeper Than Darwin, a feature that Jack calls striding. He writes in his current book, quote, "The birth of life introduced an unprecedented synthetic note of striving into the cosmic symphony." So pretty. All life begins, all living beings have to strive, to try, or to endeavor to achieve goals if they are to be and stay alive. But striving is impossible without centered subjects, selves, to do the striving. The fact of striving is what gives life both uniqueness and unity. Another key feature of selves and their aims is that they are not deterministic. They operate by manipulating possibilities, likelihoods. Engineers carefully design machines with constraints, like gears, valves, and brakes, that guarantee that the machine works like clockwork. We would quickly regret buying a car whose operation is based on continuously countering the probability that it will fall apart. As selves have evolved, they've acquired and conserved redundancies that buffer uncertain outcomes. If System X falters, System Y can hopefully take up the slack until X regenerates. But clocks, we are not. Two activities combine to maximize the self-regeneration telos of the self. The first, self-repair, serves to replace components of the system as they degrade or are lost. Self-repair entails obtaining sources of energy from the environment and using them to build or rebuild what is required for the cycles to continue. Although an autogen can be envisaged that obtains these external resources solely by chance, any autogen with the capacity to recognize and selectively obtain such resources will obviously function more effectively and be more likely to stay alive. A familiar term for this capability is awareness, which might have started out as a crude ability, but has evolved into something highly refined, a process that we can call attunement. All present-day selves are highly attuned to the environments they inhabit, aiming to find what they need and ignoring most everything else. Not ignored, however, are features of the environment that threaten the self's integrity, generating systems of self-protection. Hence, early selves came to embody a system of evaluation. Sugar in the environment is good. A metal that blocks metabolic cycles is bad. All cells aim to avail themselves of the good and protect themselves from the bad. Their telos includes values. Value systems entail interpretation. A sugar-rich circumstance is interpreted as good, a toxic metal-rich circumstance as bad. Hence, the selective autogen and all subsequent cells can be said to not only be aware of value-related externalities, but also to interpret them, to find meaning in them. We humans are so awash in our neural language-based systems of interpretation that we need reminding that we possess a specialized and very deeply powerful version of what all cells possess. A third feature of all cells is reproduction. While an original autogen might have been able to maintain itself but not generate additional versions of itself, and might have hung around for a while, it would eventually succumb to the second law, and that would be the end of that idea. Any additional versions would enhance the aim of staying alive by generating more cells with that aim. Let me quickly correct any misunderstandings that these ideas suggest that all cells are go-it-alone entities. The autogen certainly was, since it inhabited a sterile planet. But as cells evolved and multiplied, their environments came to include other cells of their own kind and other kinds that constrain and enable their flourishing. Our present-day planet is teeming with both the interrelationship and the interdependence of cells. To close, I would say that Terry's account is key to grasping the foundation of what Jack calls the inside story. Cells with goals, purposes, and values arise from self-imposed and self-maintained constraints on dynamic possibilities. Cells transform the universal dynamics of cause and effect into the life-based dynamics of means to ends. It's an account that I very much hope will soon find its way into the big history canon and also into Jack's forthcoming religious reflections. Thank you.
What a marvelous reflection on the cell as self. That's a wake-up call.
And on constraint and novelty and enabling. Mary Evelyn, can we call for your response?
Professor Mary Evelyn Tucker from Yale's School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and Yale Divinity School. I know her well.
I can say more about it than that.
And she has a wonderful book among her many collections, Worldly Wonder. So if you're looking to follow up some of her remarks, that might be a way. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, sir. I want to give big thanks actually to Lowell and Lucy and all the great organizers of this conference, and to shout outs to Sun Yue in China and the work that's happening in the Asian world, and Mojan and Dominican. There's so many people I look out here and what Billy Grassi has done over the years, and certainly what Paula and Sam are doing with this oratorio tomorrow. It's a great community, and it's an emerging community, and emergence is taking place right now in many ways. And so my other shout out is to David Christian, and I'm so honored that you're here. And your comment this morning, you see, on indigenous traditions, Aboriginal traditions, 50,000 years of an animate universe, is absolutely relevant to what we're talking about here. Yeah, so thank you for that. And as I say, this dialogue is getting richer and richer with each year. So what I want to say is we have, as we know, a fantastic new story that is being put together right here, right now, but by many of the sciences, and now joined by the humanities. This is an unprecedented moment, as we heard this morning in the plenaries. And as we know, so how we capture this moment and bring it forward is our challenge. all of the sciences are giving us a glimpse of this great epic of evolution. The link between cosmos, earth, and human, which the Chinese understood beautifully. That's the resonant symphony of Confucianism, in fact. So we have a variety of forms, as we know. We have a scientific telling of this story in someone like Eric Chasen, Cosmic Evolution. We have the extraordinary contributions of Ursula and that magnificent talk, I might add. And I really recommend Sacred Depths of Nature to you. We have the big history telling of David and Cynthia Brown and Craig Benjamin and Fred Spear and many others. We also have the Journey of the Universe telling, which I'll mention here, obviously, where we're trying to integrate the sciences and all of the humanities, including history, art, literature, philosophy, and religion. This is the whole humanities have to be part of this conversation. And that's the invitation here for continuing that dialogue. So ours is really a fusion in that work of science and humanities. It's in the genre of Lauren Isley, the book in particular, if you remember Immense Journey and some of his extraordinary work. He was an anthropologist here at UPenn. But the idea there is to awaken awe, wonder, beauty, complexity, and empathy, as was mentioned this morning, and action. As Thomas Berry used to say, a great story for a great work. And that is our challenge. That is what our students, not just our amazing students at Yale, but students everywhere, want to feel what they can contribute, how they belong. And this is the invitation in this particular panel. How do we belong to this process? So I'm going to, at the risk of hopefully not offending David, but there was a Washington Post review of the origin, your new origin story, which may be a little unfair. It just came out on the 23rd of July, I believe. And it said, this is an extraordinary story, but perhaps rendered not as deeply as we might want or wish. And that is the challenge. He was saying, how magnificent, but maybe shallow, because it doesn't go into this interiority. Now, I want to applaud the research that has gone into big history. But there's an element of truth, you see, in this review that we're inviting all of us to enter into something bigger, to increase big history, to open up the inside dimension, which of course is what Jack Haught's book is doing as well. So we need a deep perspective, deep time, that invitation that you've spoken about so eloquently. We are at this juncture where our imaginations, our souls and spirit have to expand into what does it mean to be an Earth being, a planetary being, and a cosmic being. That is part of our challenge for a future which is still uncertain. And what an exciting challenge, because the issue is that both scientific and historical tellings at the moment, not all, and what Ursula said, is a grand exception, but many scientific and historical tellings are leaving out interiority or subjectivity. And Thomas Berry's most famous phrase was, the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And if we view this as an objective or dead universe, how can we care for it? How can we continue it? How can we be cooperative partners in its future? So that's what's at stake. What does a communion of subjects mean? And that's not clear in a box. It needs to be explored further. So Haught makes this a critique of this perspective of a dead universe, if you want, and we're indebted to his long effort in religion and science at great odds, and we really applaud that. In Cosmic Story, he underscores the inadequacy of both science and religion, as he's just put out, in not acknowledging multiple ways of knowing. The humanities are a rich multiple way of knowing. So are the sciences, so is engineering, so is technology. But if we are going to deify science and engineering in academia and elsewhere, and put all other ways of knowing to the side, we do it at great cost, not only to ourselves, but to the future. So scientific materialism has no use for religion. Religious transcendence has no use for matter or this world. These are very rough positions, but this is what Jack was laying out, and he points to this third way, an anticipatory consciousness and an unfinished universe, which he develops in his book. All of these are very useful distinctions, but they're only partly there. Why? Haught is trying to bring us beyond cosmic pessimism of Bertrand Russell to a cosmic hope of Teilhard, and I appreciate that enormously as a person who's supported the Teilhard Association with John for many, many years. And he's trying to bring us from materialism to a mystery of being. And by the way, even in the Earth Charter, we put the sense that we're part of mystery. Why can't we embrace a word like that? You see, a mystery of being. That we're moving from science can explain it all to an openness to the unknown and multiple ways of knowing. So a major solution is acknowledging interiority, or this communion of subjects. Interiority of the whole evolutionary process. And that is what's at stake. Consciousness is not just here, I think, therefore I am. A Descartesian modern worldview is totally insufficient. We know that. So interiority is very human-centered still in our thinking, anthropocentrism and so on. And even Jack's book, I have to say, as much as I like it, has a strong emphasis on the presence of interiority in the world's religions. Especially in the second axial age, and the perspective of the dawning of rightness through the world's religions. So I would have some disagreements with his definition of religion from John Walker, as it remains somewhat in the frame of Western religious understanding. And I think if we are going to integrate anything about religion, we've got to take off the lens of theism or Western traditions. And Walker, while he tries, he's still in that framework. The traditions I study of Asia are so far from that framework and need to be brought into the conversation, and I think would liven it, because they are living traditions. The Confucian tradition was being radically revised in China and so on. We ignore it to our peril. The Chinese government has revived the teaching of the Chinese classics and so on, which I can talk about more. But when we leave out Confucianism, we're leaving out a 5,000-year tradition that has arguably influenced more people over time than any other tradition. This large-scale revival in China would be one example. And while Confucianism could be included in Haught's template of rightness, it would be more correct to see it aims at harmony with the cosmos, with Earth, and with humans. This would be true for Taoism, too, which would strongly eschew rightness as a category. Both these traditions are this worldly oriented, not otherworldly. Both of them are profoundly concerned with qi, with matter energy, how it is cultivated in the human and present in the whole of the natural world. And qi is one of the entry points into this discussion of interiority. And I'm saying both indigenous peoples understood matter energy, its dynamic, changing forms. So did Confucianism and Taoism for 5,000 years. So the aliveness of Earth and living systems is what we're talking about. Indigenous, Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist as well. So this brings me to the major point, that the religions of East Asia have all had a profound sense of the dynamic flow of matter and energy. Matter is not dead, but filled with energy that is differentiated in the physical and biological and human worlds. Matter has interiority, it's energy. Even in rocks and jade, the gardens of Suzhou, the Zen gardens of Japan, are filled with a sense that those rocks have their own energy and dynamics. IMP is hugely influenced by this perspective and so on. So the physical and the biological world are infused with qi. And that sensibility of matter and energy is what orients and grounds humans and their efforts to place themselves in the world. What is Confucianism about? What is Taoism about? It's cultivating the qi, Tai Chi, Qi Gong, the martial arts, etc. So that you are part of a living, dynamic, fecund, changing universe. The I Ching is all about this. Feng Shui is about how we place ourselves in directions, in colors, and so on, in relation to the material world. Okay, another example of this is in process theology, such as Teilhard and Whitehead. And John's giving me a look, but I have 2 more points. So that matter in a Teilhardian or Whiteheadian context evolves towards greater complexity and greater consciousness over time is because both of them accept a within of things, an interiority to things. That the within of things as present from the beginning blossoms forth into sentience, differentiated in various forms of life, as Ursula has just outlined. So this is coherent with what science is now giving us. We can't just refer to a blanket statement that reductionist scientists as all science, by no means. So with a further understanding of interiority, we can deepen our appreciation for the vast unfolding processes of evolution. And indeed, this is what is required to give birth to a new worldview and a new story that is integrated, joining science and humanities, that is energizing, inspiring, new forms of consciousness and conscience. So, let me conclude by suggesting that this missing element of a scientific and big history telling is the interiority all the way down, or all the way up, from the great flaring forth to the present. The communing of subjects is not just a poetic metaphor. It is part of the unfolding process of evolution over a 14 billion year process. And here's how the sciences are giving us this sensibility. And here is why it is so exciting. And this, as Ursula has said too, is what we need to integrate. That these are more than mechanistic processes, they're organic processes, more than random processes, but emergent processes, more than a purposeless universe, but self-organizing, even with telos in these processes, as Ursula said. And maybe even more than the metaphor of a competitive universe which dominates our thinking. Steve Pacala, a terrific biologist at Princeton, invited us to call Journey of the Universe an invitation to a cooperative universe. Let's have some different metaphors here. So this is coming at every stage. Physics is giving us, on the atomic stage, the tremendous interdependence of atomic structures. The astronomy is giving, from stars to galaxies, is giving us tremendous sense of emergence. And those same Princeton scientists said, we don't fully know how galaxies emerge, but we're studying them. That's humility, which we also need. Geology, with planetary formations, the self-organization of plate tectonics. Biology, Ursula's just done it, how life complexifies. Symbiosis, as you just heard last night with Lynn Margulis. Ecology, with creative disequilibrium of people like Botkin, and so on. And this movement towards whole Earth system science is absolutely coherent with where big history can be going, is going. The atmospheric sciences, where temperature, the thin atmosphere, is self-regulating. Lovelock called that the Gaia theory, but we can call it however we like. Animal behavior with differentiated sentience, marine life, songs of dolphins and whales. This is tremendous sentience differentiated throughout the living world. The mammalian life of emotion and even culture in animals, as Pons is telling us. Insect world of social forms that Ed Wilson's been doing forever. Bird migrations and patterns which we barely understand. The same with turtles and salmon and so on. This is living systems and patterns. So, there is a robust literature not only in the sciences, but available to those of us interested in this coevolution of a living universe. For example, forests as living systems, how forests think, Edward O'Connor, doing a semiotics of the interaction of forest systems, roots, and plants, and so on. So rich, based on the Ecuadorian Amazon. The hidden life of trees. You've seen these books. You see, talking about this interdependence. Glaciers. Do glaciers listen? David Abram with his Spell of the Sensuous, or Becoming Human. Incredible reflections on this. The Animate Earth of Sean Harding at Schumacher College. Living Earth of Dwayne Elgin. And finally, Grading Sweetgrass, which you might know from Rob's humor, blending traditional environmental knowledge and scientific knowledge. So Journey of the Universe, and I think Big History as well, can join this conversation. That's what we hope to do, actually, in some small conferences and stuff, to join this conversation of how these living Earth systems can infuse a sense that the whole evolutionary process, while differentiated, has forms of awareness, of sentience, and so on, that will help us connect and therefore act for a flourishing future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Evelyn, especially for bringing the example of chi to our attention. I think that's helpful for the discussion. I was also hearing boundary, which I felt Mary Evelyn was tending towards Jack's position of interiority in the whole process. And I wondered if Ursula, and this is a question for later, but a boundary with regard to self. The cell is the boundary line itself is not found in inanimate matter. So, Lowell, is it possible to invite you to the podium? And while you're walking there, I'd like to cover you with laurels. Because you've done such a magnificent job. Of the Big History Society, you've welcomed us so graciously, so I wanted to do the same to you and indicate Lowell is a Gustafson, a professor of political science here at Villanova, and so the welcoming institution radiates through him. And his work in foreign relations, especially international relations, is evident in his publications. Thucydides's theory of international relations, she had that resonance back into human cultural developments as big history brought to that understanding, and then into the present, the sovereignty dispute over the Falkland Islands, a very contemporary, relevant issue. So, Lowell, we're very keen to hear your perspective.
Good. Thank you. First of all, thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And many thanks to John. We are really indebted to him in any number of ways. I think a couple of those ways are that he has thought seriously about how to integrate, how to synthesize, how to rethink religion in light of science and the deep past. This is not a fifth grade understanding of religion. This is a sophisticated rethinking. David Christian did that with history. He's educated in the field of history. He read science and he rethought what history meant as a result of that. And I think that this is what we need to do, those of us who are in the social sciences and the humanities. What does it mean for politics, my field of political science? What does it mean for us? Given the deep past and science, how can we rethink what it means to be political animals, as Aristotle said that we were? So I think we're also indebted to John for this insight of anticipation, of looking forward to, not seeing big history just as looking back, but we're looking forward to a better, a fuller understanding of what the past is. We have been very surprised in the last century how long the past goes. We have a new understanding of the past. The past is different than it used to be. And it's because of those darn people in the sciences that we cast our thinking about that. And I think that that's a very important thing, that we are looking forward in many ways, even as we study things from the past. So there's a lot that we're indebted to John for. I think we're indebted to all the panelists. I think what they're doing is really important. Mary Evelyn was talking about the importance of the Asian traditions. John Drew saying that they were just at the Crow Reservation. the need to rethink our own individual religious traditions and the religious traditions of others, and how to integrate these, how to put them together. At my university, we celebrate Veritas and Unitas, right? What is as true as we can say it now? And if we're going to ask questions like, where did we come from and what does it mean to us now? The only way we can start to answer those questions is to practice Unitas, to form a universal story through the integration of the various stories that we have learned from the Crow, from Confucius, from Judeo-Christianity, from the astronomers, and from the physicists. How do we unite these to form a community of knowledge, a universe? How does a universe of knowledge justify a university, which Villanova claims to be? But what's the intellectual justification for the university other than just a bureaucratic collection of a bunch of departments competing for resources? That's really what it's become, isn't it? And it's a tragedy, it's a perversity of what the university is supposed to be. So this is what I think we're trying to do, is to put these things together in as truthful a way as we're able to do. And how can we go about doing that? And in this regard, I have to say, I'm just speaking for myself. I am not speaking for the IBHA or anybody else, because I'm probably wrong. And if I disagree with anybody, it probably just means that I don't understand them. But let me just say where I am on this anticipatory march that we've got, this pilgrimage towards a fuller understanding of the integration of these different fields. And what have I learned from science? I'm not an astronomer and I'm not a physicist. So when I start talking about that, everyone should get just a little bit nervous. But what do I learn when I read about the atom? Well, I hear about Democritus. You know, he wanted that uncuttable thing in the ancient Greece. That if I could just keep cutting everything that I've done, down to that final little thing that's uncuttable, then, and how it all gets rearranged and put together into this fabulous diversity. That's what he's looking for. He's wrong. And why he's wrong is because he looked for a single little building block. And we've been looking at that for a long time. In my discipline, people routinely refer to an atomistic society. And when they say that, what they mean is that you and I are ultimately just big atoms. We're these little billiard balls which are sitting on tables, unconcerned with each other most of the time. Once in a while something happens, so we knock into each other and then we go bouncing off. And that's the image of an atomistic society. That comes from Democritus. And he's wrong because he's looking at a thing like a little hard single billiard ball. What have the physicists with the Standard Model taught us about the atom? It's not a single little unitary thing. It's a complicated set of relationships. And you've got the quarks, which aren't, they're such fuzzy little things. What are these quarks anyway? But they're not little billiard balls, whatever they are, and they don't live independently. Almost immediately, and you correct me when I'm wrong, please. Don't interrupt too often. They don't exist independently. The two ups and a down, or two downs and an up, immediately form a relationship. Mediate the strong force mediated by, the gluons mediate the strong force, forming a relationship between these two things, forming either protons or neutrons. What we start from at the beginning is relationship. Think about the etymology of religion. I'm quite intrigued by that. It comes from the Indo-European, the same root language of Sanskrit and Latin, as I understand. In Latin, it's religare. So religion comes from this root word lig or lig. It's the same root word we get from ligament. And think about what a ligament is. It's this thing which ties two bones together so that I now have a leg and I can walk, enabling me to do something that I couldn't do if those two bones weren't connected in some way. So the legal leg is not about tying something back, it's about tying something together in a new way so that it can do things that weren't possible before. And so if you look at the etymology of religion, it really doesn't start with the gods or with theism. It starts with relationship, I think, coming through the Indo-European and then Latin and now the word religion in English. That insight that I get from the Indo-Europeans, and then what I hear from the physicists, that the atom ultimately is this complex set of relationships between up and down quarks, protons and neutrons, and then they have the electron with the electromagnetic force. That simplest of atoms is a complex set of relationships. And then we start forming molecules, and they start sharing electrons, these different elements. And you have a molecule, which is a more complex thing, because they've got this interaction to sharing of the electron. And what we go through in this series of thresholds, if you will, is more and more complexity in the relationships. What I so appreciated about Tyler Volk's book, From Quarks to Culture, and that word he uses is combogenesis. What I think he's talking about is that you have relationship within relationship within relationship. You're combining more relationships over time, and you're getting more and more complex entities. When you start learning what the sciences are telling us, and then you get to Ursula's work on these different chemicals forming even more complex chemicals and amino acids and proteins, and you put that together with lipids, and so you have cell boundaries somehow, and you have metabolism, and you have some way of creating food out of air and water, this magnificent discovery that somehow these single cells discovered. How could you not have a sense of the sacredness like what Ursula has? Whatever the sacred is, it's wonder and awe. You look in a microscope and you look at these cells and you consider how billions and billions of them then form relationships, so that I can stand here and pontificate for 20 minutes, and you're willing to listen to me.
No, not that long.
Not that, like 10 minutes, I've always Then you have to have a sense of wonder and awe. So that's our response to the self. Anyway, we go through this increasing complexity in our relationships until finally we get to us. And Fred Spear and others like to comment about how our brain, what is it, 100 billion neurons with, what is it, a trillion or 100 trillion synapses or something, the most complex matter in the universe. Somehow, in this exchange of chemicals and electrons between the neurons, we have our memories and anticipations and creativity and the ability to communicate symbols here as we're doing now, forming relationships. And we form more and more complex relationships. This is why political anthropology fascinates me. We start maybe with the family, with kinship groups, and we go to villages and cities and nations and empires, and now we're in this weird transitional period of sort of moving to globalism or planetization or not, and maybe it'll break down. We'll see what happens. But that's the issue of what can we learn from this? What difference does it make to me about what the answers are to where did we come from? How did we get here? What were the steps in the past? Made the T-shirt, but it took 14 billion years to produce you. Start acting like it. What does it mean to us now? What I should do, given this, and what I get from this story is that you and I are in this incredibly complex set of relationships. That relationship is the meaning of the story from the atom or from quarks up until the development. We have an increasingly complex set of relationships. And once we get to consciousness and self-consciousness, and when we become that part of the universe which can not only reflect on itself, but can start participating in the act of creating greater complexity in our relationships, that's when it starts being musical to my political science ears. Because where we are now is the need to somehow go beyond the fear of the Russians. We had a Russian scholar who couldn't get a visa to come and join us here because he has visited Iran and Syria. That's sad to me. I'm very distressed about that, because somehow we need a politics and understand Aristotle when he said we are a political animal, that we and what does that mean? It doesn't mean that we're devious and cunning and trying to oppress each other, you know. That's sort of anti-politics. Politics is about the regular, sustained, structured relationships between us. The protons can last for a long time. What we need to do is to try to be as smart as the protons were. How are we going to structure our relationships so that they're sustainable, so that we can respect the nature from which we emerged? And the Greeks love to talk about our human nature. How did human nature come from nature? How can we learn from the relationships that are inherent in nature? How can we be creative as nature was? There were no stars, and there were, and there were no life, and then there was. How can we be as creative as nature is, creating that next level of complexity in our relationship? That's what religion is for me. Does it dismiss God? Well, maybe a fifth grade understanding of what God is, but maybe that's what God is this impulse towards developing more sustainable, structured, long-lasting, intimate relationship. That's what leads us to the third word in my university's motto, caritas, which can be translated in different ways. It could be said to be charity, but that has some funny connotations in English. It could be said to be love, but that's got a hallmark interpretation of what it is. Maybe caring is a nice term. That I care about, I care for, I want to cultivate this, that what goes on out there matters to me. I'm in relationship with it. I care about it. I care about you, and it matters to me. And so I can exit that this story helps us gain a sense of why we actually do care about each other and exercise caritas and come to a re-understanding of what Augustine meant 1,600 years ago. If we didn't learn anything in the last 1,600 years, the fault would be ours and not Augustine. He was wrong about some stuff, but he was right about a few things as others were in the past. And so how can we learn from this to develop that next level of sustainable structured relationships, the next level? How can we anticipate this in the future? And I think John's been very patient and he wants me to sit down, so I'm going to.
For this meditation on relationships, and I feel the echoing back to constraint and enabling in the cell, how those relationships take on the physiognomy, almost the face. And I'm thinking of where Jack has led us into these three modelings, and it reminds me of a biologist who once described his work by saying, I observe, I cherish, and I model. And I think he had your caritas in mind. Jose, Carlos, Pons, please come to the podium. Jose. And we first met Jose at Yale when he did a master's, and Jose and I walked 23 blocks during the climate march without stumbling on a stone, but we were talking constantly about these ideas. So it's a friendship built on a long climate march also. Now Jose is a graduate student, a PhD student at Georgetown University in environmental history, studying with John McNeil. And this summer he's working at the Smithsonian. We might hear something about that in your remarks. So please.
Thank you. Good. Thank you, John. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I feel underqualified among such enlightened and experienced panel. I'm not a cosmologist nor a theologian, and what I hope to provide succinctly, in the interest of time and questions, is a perspective from a graduate student. And I've had the opportunity to read and discuss a few books on big history, through classes with John Gren, Mary Ellen Tucker, John McNeil. And one concern or question that often arises when discussing big history among students, and I hope I'm characterizing this fairly is sort of why does big history matter for historians, for scholars, the so what question and how we can make this meaningful. And some of the answers that come from these discussions include, for instance, a sentiment of connections and trying to understand how our own ideas, our own actions are connected to places and times that are very different than from what we expected. So there's, of course, always a remark, well, not always, but one brought by the book that we're discussing today, sort of what are we missing still from sort of these stories, and this is a sentiment of, or the more of a perspective that, a perspective of religious experience and how that might be included and into a big history perspective. Of course, you know, the idea of looking for a purpose and the religious experience is one that probably everyone in the room has felt and still feels, and probably every single person that has stepped on the planet has felt. And so there's an excellent point to be made about trying to include this perspective. Whether these perspectives are completely similar or whether they converge, I think is an aspect that needs to be more thoroughly discussed, as other panelists have mentioned. The perspective of the book includes mostly the Abrahamic religions and the actual age religions. And I think, more importantly, I think it's important to think about what is meant by the inside story, and whether that is something that is intelligible or not. I think this matters because we live in an age, as a student and as a citizen, where what is a fact and what is not a fact is very much contested on a daily basis. So the idea of coming onto an agreement of what constitutes truth, and I'm doing this to signal quotations, is important because that means that, I mean, we need to think through how different systems of knowledge can really, you know, be synthesized or cannot be synthesized. Yes, so in reflecting on whether what is sort of this inner experience, a question that arose as I read the book is, can subjective experiences be translated into verifiable understanding and in something that you could share with a wider number of people? Because, as I mentioned, if this is not the case, then we get into this very dangerous discussion of what constitutes a belief, what constitutes a fact, etc. That's something to keep in mind. The other aspect that I thought was interesting for me and worth discussion regards the degree to which scientific narratives can lead to despair. As it's been mentioned by the panelists, and as you know, the perfect example is how I met John Grimm, and that was through action, and that was by walking. Well, I didn't meet him there, but that's how we started building our relationship. There's a relationship between getting to engage with knowledge and understanding of the natural world and caring for it and being active about it. There's a section in the book that talks about waiting, and I'm afraid that people will wait for too long. And that is a central concern that I think many people share. So I would need to sort of understand better for how long should we wait, and whether that's something that is in the purpose of people today. And my other comments is with regards to science, again, as a narrative, but as an unfolding story in of itself. Much of the book discusses science as something that is sort of stale and that has sort of these assumptions about the past, but not as an unfolding story, which is arriving to new understanding about the very serious questions that motivate the book, which is trying to understand what is the purpose of why are our lives meaningful, and sort of where are we going with all this. And in that respect, I think that the connection between evolution and the fundamental forces of the universe is going to hopefully give some understanding on this connection between life and sort of the water processes that are happening in the universe. I don't necessarily think this needs to be a story of despair that leads to inaction. I think it can very much be understood as a story through which we make meaning in the present, and we act on that meaning. And I guess the last remark I would like to make focuses on how we can focuses on the discipline of history and what big history and religion mean for history. And this relates to my first comment, and I think that to be able to integrate different perspectives, they need to be able to talk to one another. And for them to do that, they need to rely on a similar ontological system of understanding. When this doesn't happen, then I find it more difficult for them to really create a synthesis that can speak to the constituents that are involved in sort of discussion. This is all I have for now, but I'm looking forward to your questions.
Appreciate that. I would say bringing us back again to narrative and asking us really to consider the role of narrative in these remarks. I think it's appropriate. Jack, would you like something to drink? I have some lemonade somewhere. You over again? Who stole my lemonade? Yes. Who stole my lemonade? Very likely. And while Jack's drinking that, I'd like to say 5 minutes, Jack, if that's enough to give you time to think about it. And then if anyone on the panel wants to make a very short intervention, and then let's throw it out. And my understanding is that we go till 3:30.
No, it's 3:30. There was a dude when we were coming in the door.
I know, but
Oh, there goes your time, Jack.
So why was that guy saying?
my mistake.
Oh, I timed it for that in mind. I'm really sorry, everybody. I
just check with her.
Oh, well, let's go 5 minutes for yourself. Yeah.
Maybe less than 5 minutes. First of all, thank you all for your very challenging and exciting responses to my own efforts. And I want to try to synthesize this kind of response. I think every response that I heard has something to do with what I call awakening. And I want to put everything back into a context where we all recognize that we live in a universe that's awakening. It used to be thought that awakening was something that human subjects did. But now that we have this long cosmic story, we realize that the roots of awakening extend back 13.8 billion years, and if there are other universes besides this one, then somehow they statistically are still part of the whole scheme of probability that would allow our universe, perhaps alone, to be an awakening universe. universe. So I want to include a multiverse possibility within this whole phenomenon of awakening. But awakening is something we take so much for granted. We approach it psychologically, biologically, historically, and so forth. But now we have the opportunity to approach awakening and everything else cosmically, cosmologically. And what we see is this grand drama of a universe that hasn't just decided to stay still, unconscious, and mindless throughout endless ages, but has erupted into subjectivity. The kind of subjectivity which each of you is palpably experiencing in your own minds right now, in your own inquiry. And you and I are just as much part of the universe as rocks and rivers. So in the anticipation of truth, of meaning, truth, goodness and beauty that characterizes our own intense awakening, it's the whole universe surging up through each one of us, awakening. And I just want to ask the question, awakening to what? And when I ask that question, it seems to me that, at least I need a metaphysical framework to respond to that question. And as I look at the offerings and possibilities of describing metaphysics, by the way, is simply the philosophical term for what is really real. As I look at the materialist framework, what is really real is something that is, by definition, not awakening. So I want to find a framework for all that the sciences are now discovering about the nature of this awakening universe. And Ursula, I certainly appreciate your phenomenology of emergence, and I pretty much embrace that. The only difference is that I want to find in Terry Deacon and others who talk about emergence a metaphysical framework that can make sense of emergence. And bottom-up explanation, as I tried to describe in my brief talk, amounts to a kind of metaphysics of the past. So what I'm looking for is a metaphysics of the future, in which the future is not simply nothing. It's perhaps not yet, but it's replete with possibilities. And possibilities, as Alfred North Whitehead said, don't just float in from nowhere. Where are these rooted? Where are these possibilities which make a future happen? Where are they resident? What repository do they reside in? And in asking questions like that, I think the notion of God still makes sense. And I just want to comment on one other thing about Lowell's emphasis on relationality. I think that is very, very important because awakening physically and cosmically has required an intensification of relationships. The complexification of matter is necessary for the emergence of sentience and eventually consciousness and so forth. And this complexity is a matter of intensification of relationships. And I think perhaps that maybe we can rethink the cosmic hierarchy that I was talking about in another sort of way from the traditional way, and that's a hierarchy of intensity of relationality. For example, we can think of a rock as related to its environment in a rather impersonal sort of way. But when we look at a plant, we see it puts its roots down into the soil and forms a very intense kind of relationship with its environment. Then when animals come along, they can roam around in their ecological niche and form an even more intense kind of relationality to their environment, to their world. And humans, within this hierarchy, can form an almost indefinite degree and intensity of relationships to their world. And we can even define freedom in a way, in terms of relationship. Freedom is the capacity for intensifying relationships. Being intensifies to the extent that we relate to a complexity, to a plurality of the humans, but also animals and their environment in general. And even so, our kind of relationality has restrictions on it. It is limited. Some Christian theologians, for example, have proposed that we're in a position now to think of God not the way medievals did, as unrelated or other outside this world, but as being distinct in that the divine relationality is unrestricted, so that God would be absolutely related of reality. And if you think of the divine in that way, then everything that happens in the cosmos, in some sense, intensifies the life and the being of the divine, and vice versa. So there are different ways that have been devised, especially around the relationship, or thinking, rethinking everything. But relationship, I'll just close with this, relationship is also absolutely necessary for this phenomenon that I'm calling a cosmic awakening. And awakening, of course, is something that requires subjects that are awakening. But now we realize, as a result of physics, astrophysics, biology, geology, and everything else, this awakening that we associate with human subjectivity is something that has been prepared for from the very start. So, unfortunately, the modern world has been defined almost by a kind of assumption that it has inherited from the medieval world, that somehow subjects are not part of nature. We can now do away with that. And when we do away with that, we get a completely different understanding, not only of nature, but also of ourselves.
I'm so moved to hear a central term from the Enlightenment period, Aufklärung, that sense of awakening. And here we have a totally new turn, where it's not simply the human that's awakening, but rather the awakening universe, which we give expression to. So please join me in thanking our panelists.